A. German Shepherd disappears for months when he returns. She's not the same. What happens when loyalty is met with abandonment? This canine German Shepherd once served with unwavering devotion, but when his handler, an ex-military man, left him behind, he vanished. Without a trace months later, when he was finally found, he was nothing like the proud and powerful dog. Hence was what happened to him, and could he ever learn to trust again? Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this toy. He was once a warrior, a protector, a partner, but now he was just a shadow of what he used to be when they found him. He was barely standing, his ribs visible through his thin coat, his eyes hollow with something that hadn't been there before. Something had broken inside him. But this wasn't the end of his story. The wind howled through the empty alleyways, carrying the scent of rain and damp pavement somewhere. In the distance, a siren wailed, cutting through thunderbolt night air. In the shadows, beneath a rusted fire escape, a figure lay motionless, a German Shepherd, once a proud and noble canine, now reduced to skin and bone. His fronts, sleek and strong, was matted with dirt, his ribs pressing against this fragile frame. His paws, once powerful enough to chase down criminals and protect this handler, now trembled with exhaustion. His eyes, once filled with sharp focus and unwavering loyalty, were dull and lifeless. 4 months she had wandered for. She had searched for a voice that never called his name, for footsteps that never returned. He had been left behind 1 year earlier. Sergeant Logan Carter stood in front of the kennel, his hands tightening into fists across from him. Axel, his canine partner, stood at attention, ears pricked, eyes locked on his handler, waiting for the next command, waiting for direction, waiting for him. "Are you sure you want to do this?" the Bass veterinary asked, her voice uncertain. Logan's jaw clenched. He couldn't look at Axel. Not now. He's no longer needed. His voice was flat, motionless. "I can't take him with me." The words tasted bitter in his mouth. Axel tilted his head slightly, sensing the tension, but it didn't break his posture. He was trained to follow orders without hesitation, but it didn't understand this one. Logan the vet continued, softer this time. "He's not just a dog." "I know," but knowing didn't change reality. Logan had served to 10 years, and now it was over. He was being discharged, his military career caught by an injury that noon could see, but that controlled everything. The weight of it pressed on him, suffocating. He needed to start over, to move forward, and in his mind, Axel was a part of his pasts. So he turned and walked away. He didn't look back. If he had, he would have seen Axel watching him, ears flattening slightly, his tail lowering in confusion. He would have seen the way his partner, his friend, waited, even as the kennel door closed behind him, waited for him to come back. But Logan never did. Present day, the German Shepherd's body twitched in his sleep, his dreams filled with echoes of the past. The sharp commands, the sound of gunfire, the scent of his handler's uniform. He whimpered, his paws jerking, as if he were still chasing down an enemy, still protecting someone who no longer wanted him. A distant noise made his ears flick. His body was weak, but instinct overrode exhaustion. He lifted his head slightly, his muscles protesting in pain. A figure was approaching, footsteps slow and cautious, a man in dark clothing, carrying something in his hands. The Shepherd growled, a weak sound, but a warning nonetheless. The man hesitated, then crouched down. "Easy, buddy," he murmured. "I'm not there to hurt you." The dog didn't move, his body tensed, every survival instinct in high alert. The man set something down, a small container. The scent of food drifted into the Shepherd's nose, and despite everything, hunger clawed at his stomach. The man didn't move closer, didn't force anything. He just waited, and for the first time in months, someone was waiting for Axel. Axel's body trembled as she stared at the food. His instincts told him to be wary, to stay on guard, but hunger gwetted him stronger than his fear. His ribs ached from weeks, maybe months of starvation, and his once powerful legs barely held him upright. The man crouched a few feet away, his hands open, showing not through their mane. Still, his eyes locked onto Axel, not with pity, but with patience. "Go ahead, buddy," the man murmured. "Dit's yours." Axel's nose twitched, the scent of food overwhelmed every other thought in his mind. He took a shaky step forward, his paws sliding slightly on the wet pavement. Another step, then another. His body was weak, but desperation pushed him forward. His teeth sank into the food, devouring it, before his brain could process if it was even safe. The man didn't move, didn't try to touch him. He just watched. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" His voice was quiet, almost understanding. Axel barely noticed. His focus was only on the meal in front of him, duven a sheet. His ear stayed pricked, listening for sudden movement, for danger. The man remained still, let Axel finish. When the last bite was gone, Axel lifted his head, lightly licking the remnants from his dry lips. His body trembled with exhaustion, but for the first time in weeks, his stomach wasn't empty. The man exhaled softly, shifting slightly but not getting up. "I don't know who left you out there, but they don't deserve you," he said, more to himself than to the dog. "You're a fighter, Axel didn't react. He wasn't ready to. Trust not, the man slowly reached into his coat, pulling out a small water bottle. He unscrewed the cap and poured a little into a metal dish here. He said, sliding it forward. Axel hesitated, sniffing. His throat burned from dehydration, and the water smelled clean safe. His body screamed for it, but his mind battled against years of training. Never drop yard, never let your enemy get close. He took a step back, the Mansai head, but didn't force it. He simply set the bottle down and leaned back on his heels. You can't take your time, he murmured. I'm not going anywhere. Axel's eyes flickered toward him, analyzing, measuring. He had seen men like this before. Calm, steady, trained, not that could be afraid of a dog, but also not the kind to harm a soldier. His muscles tensed, something deep in his memory stirring. But before he could place it, exhaustion overtook him. His body gave in, his legs buckling slightly before caught themselves. The man's expression darkened with something Axel couldn't understand. Yeah, he muttered. Whoever abandoned you, they broke. You didn't they? Axel lowered his head. Yes, the man reached out slowly, his fingers grazing the edge of the empty food dish. But Axel flinched back, a deep growl rumbling in his chest. The man froze. He didn't pull away, but he didn't push forward either. Okay, he said, not ready yet. I get it. Axel watched him carefully, waiting for the moment he'd force contact. The moment that'd lash out, demand obedience, demand submission. But it never came. Instead, the man exhaled and pulled his jacket tighter around himself. It's freezing out. He murmured, I don't know where you've been, but if you stay there much longer, you won't survive another night. Axel didn't move. The man shook his head slightly, then stood up slow and deliberate. I'm not going to chase you, he said, but I'm leaving that door open. He took a step back, another. Then without another word, he turned and walked toward a truck parked at the edge of the alley. Axel's ears twitched as she watched him go. He'd been left before, thrown away, forgotten. But this was different. This man wasn't forcing him to go. He wasn't demanding anything. He had left a choice. Axel looked down at the empty bowl, then back up at the truck. The engine rumbled to life. The man sat in the driver's seat, waiting. Axel's heart pounded. Then before his mind could stop him, his legs moved one step, then another, and for the first time in months, she followed the truck's headlights cut through the dark alley, casting long shadows on the crumbling brick walls. The engine idled softly, the steady hum filling the silence. Axel hesitated near the edge of the pavement, his legs stiff, his breath shallow. The cold air bit at his exposed ribs, but he barely noticed. His focus was locked on the man sitting inside the truck. The door on the passenger side was open, an invitation, not a command. Axel's paws scraped against the wet ground as she took another slow step forward. His body screamed for rest. This instincts battled against years of training. This was a trap it had to be. He had learned that humans only offered kindness when they wanted something in return. But still he moved. The man didn't speak. He didn't make any sudden movements. She just sat there, his hand resting on the steering wheel, his expression unreadable. Axel reached the truck step and paused. His muscles trembled from exhaustion, and for a moment he considered turning back. But where? Would he go back into the cold, back into hunger? He swallowed hard. Then with a deep breath, he clambered inside. The man exhaled soft, barely making a sound. He reached for the door and shut it carefully, the lock clicking into place. Axel flinched, but didn't bolt. Choice, buddy, the man said quietly, shifting the truck into gear. Let's get you out of here. The vehicle rolled forward out of the alley, merging onto the empty streets of the sleeping city. Axel curled into the corner of the passenger seat, his body tense, his eyes scanning every movement. His breathing was shallow, controlled. He didn't trust this man, not yet. The scent of him filled the small space. Leather, coffee, something familiar but faded like gunpowder and sweat. A soldier. The realization sent a shiver down Axel's spine, something deep inside him stirring. Name's Daniel, the man said, glancing at him. Not that you care yet, but I figure we should start somewhere. Axel didn't move. Daniel's eye focusing back on the road. I don't know where you came from, Boot. You've got that look in your eyes like you've been let down one too many times. Axel blinked but said nothing. Same here. Daniel muttered. The truck rumbled on streetlights, casting fleeting shadows across Axel's face. The warmth off the cabin settled into his bones, but his body remained stiff, coiled like a spring, ready to react. Minutes passed in insolence. Then finally, the truck slowed, pulling into a long gravel driveway. Axel lifted his head slightly, scanning his surroundings. A small house is in the distance, its windows glowing with soft yellow light. A barn stood to the side, a fenced-in yard stretching behind it. The truck rolled to a stop. Daniel shut off the engine and turned to Axel. You can stay here tonight. They said no cages, no chains, just a warm place to sleep. Axel's ears flicked, analyzing his voice. No force, no threat, just words. Daniel opened his door and stepped out, leaving the passenger door open. He walked around the truck toward the porch, hands stuffed into his pocket. She didn't look back, didn't coax Axel to follow another choice. Axel's heart pounded in his chest. That had spent so long being discarded, being told who to trust, what to do. This was different. He let out a slow breath, his body still hesitant. But then he moved one step, then another, and for the second time that night, followed. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Axel's paws crunched against the gravel. Ashes stepped out of the truck. His movements slow and uncertain. The open space around him felt unfamiliar, exposed. His instinct screamed at him to run to find cover, but something held him there. Daniel didn't look back. Ashes stepped onto the porch, had pushed the front door open. The warm glow of the house spilling onto the worn wooden steps had appeared inside, leaving the doors lightly ajar. Axel stood frozen, no command, no force, another choice. His body acted from exhaustion, but his mind was still sharp, still wary. The last time he had trusted a human, he had been abandoned. The last time he'd been led into a home, it had become a cage, but the cold pressed against this thin body, a cruel reminder of the night she had spent shivering in alleyways, his stomach empty, his ribs pressing against his own skin. The houses smelled different, not like the sterile scent of a kennel, nor the harsh stench of the streets. Sitzmeld lived in warm safe. Axel took a step forward, then another, climbed the steps, cautiously pausing at the threshold, his ears pricked, scanning the space in front of him. The living room was simple, worn furniture, a coffee table cluttered with books, and an old radio playing. Something bombed in the background. A fireplace crackled in the corner, sending waves of heat through the space. Daniel stood in the kitchen, filling a bowl with water, had placed it on the floor before grabbing another dish, dumping fresh kibble inside. Axel's stomach clenched at the sight. His body wanted to lunge forward, to devour everything in an instant. But his mind held him back. "I'm not going to rush you," Daniel said, setting the food down. "You eat when you're ready." Axel's ears flicked, head didn't move. Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "You remind me of someone." Axel stayed silent, watching every movement, every subtle shift in them. Wasn't tense. He wasn't preparing to attack. He was just waiting. Daniel's eye head and leaned against the counter. "I had a doggon's head," admitted a partner. His voice lowered slightly, as if saying the words allow was harder than he expected. He was like, "You smart, brave, loyal something." Inside, Axel stirred, lost him. Daniel's eyes darkened slightly, lost in a memory, note in combat, not to a bullet, but to something worse. Axel's tail twitched slightly, his head tilting just a fraction. Daniel's jaw clenched. "When I came back, I wasn't the same, and neither was he." The words cut through the silence, heavy and raw. Axel knew that feeling. Daniel pushed off the counter and ran a hand over the back of his neck. "I don't know where you came from," he said, his voice is steadier now, "but I know what it's like to be left behind." Axel's breath slowed. His body was still tense, still wary, but something in Daniel's voice chipped away at the walls inside him. A deep atching exhaustion settled into his bones. He took a step forward, then another. He reached the food bowl, pausing just long enough to glance at Daniel, as if waiting for him to change, to become like the others. But Daniel just nodded. "Go ahead, buddy." Axel lowered his head and ate for the first time in months. He wasn't stealing scraps from the street, wasn't fighting for survival. For the first time, he was simply being given something without having to beg for it. And for the first time, he wasn't completely alone. The food disappeared quickly. Axel ate with the desperation of a starving animal, gulping down each bite, as if it might be stolen from him. His ears twitched, listening for sudden movement, his body to run if necessary, even as warmth from the fire seeped into his frozen bones. His instincts refused to let them relax. Daniel didn't move. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching with quiet patience. Hadn't speak, didn't try to touch Axel. He simply waited. When the last crumb was gone, Axel lifted his head. His tongue darted out, licking the empty bowl. His stomach finally mercifully full. His eyes flicked to Daniel, studying him, waiting. "Feel better?" Daniel asked softly. Axel didn't respond. He only stared. Daniel sighed and stepped toward the sink, filling a glass with water. His movements were slow, unthreatening. Everything about him told Axel he wasn't a danger, yet the wariness in Axel's heart refused to fade. "You don't trust me," Daniel murmured, as if reading his mind. "I get it." Axel shifted his paws, his body still tense. Daniel turned off the faucet and took a sip of his water, his walls drifting toward the window. The wind outside howled against the rattling. The MS a storm was coming, the kind of storm that made the streets unlivable. "Looks like we're stuck here for the night," Daniel muttered. Axel's ears flicked, assessing the statement. He could leave. The door was closed, but if he wanted to escape, he could find a way. He had survived months on his own, didn't need a human, but the thought of going back out there, facing the cold, the hunger, the nights alone, made something in his chest tighten. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel finally moved, grabbing an old blanket from the couch. He spread it out on the floor, a few feet away from the fireplace, then stepped back. "You can sleep here, if you want. Hissade, or wherever you're comfortable." Axel's eyes darted between him and the blanket. It was too easy to open a trap, but Daniel wasn't watching him anymore. He had turned away, walking toward the hallway. "I'm heading to bed," he said over his shoulder. "I'll leave the door open in case you need anything." And just like that, he was gone. Axel's muscles coiled. This was a test. It had to be every time a human had shown him kindness. There had been a price. Alesha Cage had padded forward, cautiously sniffing the blanket. It smelled like dust and something else, something familiar. Faces of another dog lingered in the fabric that was no longer here. Axel lowered himself and onto the floor, his muscles protesting for months of strength. The warmth off the fire brushed against this verb, but didn't close his eyes, not yet. Their spas past Axel's dreams were restless gunfire, the scent of sweat, and adrenaline commands shouted through radio static. Axel down his body moved without thinking. He dropped low, avoiding the invisible enemy. His heart pounding, had turned his head, searching for his handler, for Logan. But there was nothing, just shadows, just the empty echo of a voice that was no longer there. Axel jolted awake. The fire hatted down, leaving behind a soft glow of embers. The house was silent, except for the faint sound of the wind outside his body. His legs stiff as he pushed himself up. He turned his head lightly. Daniel was standing in the doorway. He wasn't staring, wasn't approaching, he was just there. Axel's heart pounded, his body coiled with instinct that had been caught off guard, but Daniel didn't move. "You okay?" Hest quietly. Axel didn't know how to answer that. Daniel sighed and rubbed his face. "I figured," him muttered. A long pause stretched between them. Daniel shifted, leaning against the doorframe. "You were trained, weren't you?" Axel's ears flicked. Daniel nodded a sift. The silence was confirmation enough. "I knew it these second. I saw you," he exhaled, his expression unreadable. "Used to work with dogs like you," had admitted, "overseas." His voice was quiet, careful. "Had a partner, his name was Maxwell's." Chest tightened. "We went through a lot together." Daniel continued, his eyes darkened slightly, his voice distant. "The nun day we came home and everything changed." Axel stayed frozen, listening. Daniel swallowed hard. "I thought I was doing the right thing when I let them go. Told myself it was for the best." His jaw clenched. "I regret every damn day." The weight in his voice was heavy. Real Axel didn't know this man, didn't know his past. But in that moment, he understood him. A long silences stretched between them. Then Final took a step back. Gets the murmured, "You're safe here, safe." Axel didn't know what that word meant anymore, but for the first time in months, she wanted to believe it. The curled back onto the blanket. This breathing slow. Daniel turned, walking back toward his room. He didn't look back. Axel stared at the empty doorway for a long time. Then finally, his eyes drifted shut. Axel had not slept deeply in months. Even now, in the warmth of the fire's fading embers, his body recent to fully relax. His ears twitched every shift of the wind outside, his muscles coiled with the readiness of a soldier who never truly left the battlefield. But something was different. The air in the house carried no scent of fear, not race of violence. The walls didn't echo with commands or gunfire. There was only silence. The kind that didn't feel like a threat, but like peace. For the first time since he had been abandoned. He wasn't laying awake in an alley, shivering in the cold, waiting for the next fight for survival. Their realization should have comforted him. Instead, it unsettled him. He didn't know how to exist without war. Morning came slowly, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the window, casting golden streaks across the wooden floor. Axel blinked awake, his body stiff, as he stretched his front paws, his claws scratching against the floor. The house's smelled different in the daylight, fresh coffee, faint traces of soap, something cooking. The sounds of quiet movement drifted in from the kitchen. Axel lifted his head, his ears filled the noise. He wasn't alone. He rose to his feet. This pause pressing into the blanket that had somehow become his bed, his ribs still ached, his body still weak. But there was something else now, a steadiness that hadn't been there before. He padded toward the doorway, his steps cautious but silent. Daniel stood in the kitchen, pouring coffee into a chipped mug. His movements were slow, absent-minded, as if lost in thought. This shirt was slightly wrinkled, his hair unkempt, this jaw rough with morning stubble. He looked tired, not in the way of someone who simply lacked sleep, but in the way of someone who had been carrying something heavy for far too long. Axel knew that feeling. The man turned slightly, and for the first time his gaze met Axel's in the daylight. "You're up," he said, his voice is still raspy from sleep. Axel didn't move. Daniel, and against the counter, taking a slow sip of his coffee, has studied the dog for a moment, this expression unreadable. "You going to keep watching Melik that, or do you want break fast?" Axel's ears flicked. Daniel stepped toward the fridge, pulling out a plastic container. He opened it, the scent of cooked meat filling the air. He scooped a portion into a bowl and set it on the floor. Axel hesitated. He had eaten last night. His body wasn't starved in the way it had been before, but survival instincts were hard to silence. His legs moved on their own, carrying him forward. He sniffed the food first, testing for any sign of a trick. There was none. Heat slower, this time less desperate. Daniel didn't move, didn't try to reach for him. He simply stood there, his coffee, letting Axel existing his own time. "You're trained," Daniel said, more to himself than to Axel. Axel's ears twitched. "I don't know who you belong to, but I can't tell he weren't just some stray." Daniel took another sip of his coffee, his gaze thoughtfully. "You've seen things, haven't you?" Axel didn't respond. Daniel exhaled slowly, met to a quiet standing past between them. The man placed his coffee mug down and crossed his arms. "You want to know why I brought you here?" Axel lifted his head slightly, licking the last bits of food from his muzzle. Daniel sighed. "Because I couldn't leave you out there." The words were simple, but they carried weight. "I know what it's like to be left behind," him muttered. "To be useful one day, disposable the next." Something in Axel's chest tightened. Daniel ran a hand over his face. I had a partner, a damn good one. His voice dropped slightly, like saying the word still hurt. Max Axel stilled. He was the best Tane ever worked with. Daniel's eyes, slightly his grip tightening around the edge of the counter. Saved my life more times than I can count. Axel's heart pounded. But when I came back, Daniel, voice wavered just slightly. I couldn't be what he needed, Metabe anymore. Axel didn't move. Daniels wallowed, forcing his maul bitter. Chuckles saw Thimgo. His gaze flickered toward the window, as if searching for something far beyond what was there. Told myself it was the right thing to do, that he'd be better off. Axel's breathing slowed. Daniel exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I was wrong. The word hung heavy in the air. Axel studied the man in front of him. The pain in his voice, the weight in his eyes. It was the same look Axel had seen in their reflection of puddles. When he wandered the streets, abandonment, regret. Axel's tail flicked, his body shifting slightly. Daniel's eyed, rubbing his temple. I don't know what happened to you out there. I don't know who wolfed you or why, but I do know one thing. Axel waited. You deserve better. Daniel said. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else, something heavier. Then Daniel pushed off the counter. Come on, he said, number one, nodding toward the back door. Let us get some fresh air. Axel hesitated. The door was open. Another choice. He had spent months, running months, fearing every human who crossed his path, but this time he didn't run. This time he followed the backyard, stretched beyond the porch, a wide open space framed by tall trees. The grass was damp from the morning dew, and the air carried the scent of pine and earth. It was quite peaceful. Axel stepped onto the wooden porch, cautiously. The cold breeze ruffled his fur, but for the first time in months he wasn't searching for an escape. He wasn't looking over his shoulder for danger. Daniel stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, staring out at the trees. She didn't turn when Axel peeped. Closer, you can go if you want, Daniel murmured. I won't stop you. Axel's ears twitched. I get it. Daniel continued. Trust isn't easy, especially when you've been left behind. Axel inhaled deeply. The wind carried sense of freedom, dirt, trees, the distant scent of a river. If her now noon would stop him, but he didn't move. He had spent months alone, barely surviving, and now for the first time someone was giving him a choice. Daniel turned slightly, meeting Axel's gaze. Or you can stay. His voice was softer now. It's up to you, buddy. Axel stared at him, heart pounding. Then slowly he's at down. Danielle, out of breath, nodding. He didn't need words. Axel had made his choice the first times since he was abandoned. He wasn't just surviving. He was